Hi, I'm Dr. Tim, American family doctor who loves Asia, and this is my first episode of Learn Chinese with the Bible. A number of years ago, I was reading a book by David Barton called Original Intent, and it showed me something that totally scandalized me, and it was that my dearly beloved America actually had roots of people who loved God and knew God and wanted to please and honor God. And yet my public education and the media and culture and TV had all totally purged this. And I felt like I had dug into some deep treasure. So I had this feeling of joy and anger at the same time. Joy that my country was this way, God honoring and in a lot of ways seeking righteousness, and anger that all this had been purged and hidden from me. Well, I had a similar feeling when in my years in college studying China, studying East Asia toward a bachelor's degree in that, where I started to get a sneaking suspicion that China in its ancient roots had a similar experience of loving and serving and wanting to know and honor God. It had knowledge of God, wisdom about God, faithfulness to God and His ways, and even an understanding of the promise, the primordial, super old promise that God had given humanity, that He wasn't going to leave us in our sick and depraved and broken state forever, but that He was going to send us the Son of Heaven, that He was going to send us a Savior to rescue us from all of that. And that China was actually a steward of that promise. Well, I started to get a suspicion of this, and the more I dug into more parts of Chinese history and culture, and Asian culture in general, the more I started to understand that this is actually true. And after my interest was piqued on this, I ended up coming across scholars who had spent their life digging into this. One example of this is the great Scottish scholar James Legge, L-E-G-G-E, who translated the Confucian classics, the Analects, the Book of Changes, spent his life on this, but he was a missionary who saw God in these ancient documents and literature, who saw God in the ancient liturgy that the Chinese emperor would perform on the border of his empire and later at the Temple of Heaven, the famous landmark in Beijing that can be visited by all of us today, where this liturgy was a prayer to the God who resembled in so many ways the same God worshipped by the Hebrews, without images, without idols, the God who is not capricious, who is not crazy in his behavior, who doesn't share power with anyone, the complete sovereign over the whole universe, who is righteous and good and loving toward us. So this is what many of these scholars have dug into much more than myself, but I decided as I pursued this that I would revisit the learning of Chinese with that embedded story in its original characters. And these characters that we write today are about 2,000 years old, but the original Chinese characters that the current characters are based on are sometimes more than 4,000 years old. And they tell an incredible story of the most ancient stories of humanity, the ones that would be shared by all cultures, that are made clear in the Bible in the first 11 chapters of the biblical book of Genesis. And there's 4 of these stories that I'm talking about. The creation of mankind and the fall of man, the flood that reset all of the earth, and the building of the Tower of Babel, which was the biblical story of the last time that all humanity was together, and the subsequent confusion of languages and the dispersion of nations across the earth, which would have been the beginning of the Chinese people, the beginning of any nation you might want to name. there was a time when the great purging, the great cover-up happened in Chinese history. And ironically enough, it was the time of the emperor who gave the West our current name for China. And this emperor's name was Qin Shi Huangdi. He massacred the scholars who knew the most ancient history. He burned about 3/4 of the ancient texts. He corrupted the border sacrifice that I just described. And he allowed the single God, whose name was Shangdi, to be described in 5 different ways as 5 different gods. This mistake was later corrected, but it was over 1,000 years later. So, just to recap what I've said so far, the more I studied it, the more I found out it is true that there was a purging of the knowledge of God from the roots of Asian culture, the roots of Chinese culture particularly. And it was like the purging of the knowledge of God in American culture that I discovered has happened to us. Now, when you travel in China, and I was able to travel for a year there, you hear all the time that the Chinese culture is much older than American culture. And of course that's true, it's much, much older. So the knowledge of God in Chinese culture is so old that it's embedded in the culture 100 years or so before even Abraham walked the earth. Much older than even the Jewish Hebrew people, and far, far older than Christianity. The purge of the knowledge of God is so old that it happened before even Jesus was on the scene. So the question for the Chinese is, do you want to go back that far? Do you really want to look for the roots of who you are, who we are? So that's what I'm going to explore in this series on the Chinese language. We're going to explore it together through Chinese characters. But even more important than learning Chinese is learning about God's love for you. And that is the utterly most central thing in life, is that He's reaching out to us to establish a relationship with us. He wants to bring us back to Himself, and He's wooing each of us, and there'll be a time when that process is over, and we'll have chosen either to submit to the Son of Heaven or to resist His grace. And that's a very big choice. So my goals for this series are to teach Chinese, which is the way that, not the way that I learned it, because I didn't learn it attached to any story, but I've found the Hebrew Bible, the first 11 chapters, to be the Rosetta Stone of learning Chinese characters. It's just, they stay in my memory so much better now that I see them through this lens of this first 11 chapters of Genesis. It just makes everything fit. As any scholar of Chinese knows, there is a old explanation of Chinese characters called the Shuo Wen, which was published about 100 AD or CE. We're going to go 2,000 years back further than that, because that's one Rosetta Stone we can use, but it's 2,000 years younger than most of these characters. So I'm going to be referencing certain works as we go through. These ideas are not my own. Again, I'm borrowing from a lot of other scholars, and we'll get started with the actual characters in the next video. So thank you for watching, and we'll go from there.